Hey everyone, welcome back to Global Semester, where we're all about becoming better cross-cultural representatives of Jesus Christ, both locally and globally. And in this video, we're going to continue on in the series on contextualization by highlighting the aspect of contextualizing the messenger. The goal of contextualizing the messenger is to minimize any unnecessary obstacles that might hinder a person from another culture from hearing our message. Here we can reflect on the following questions. How can we adapt to the culture? To what extent can we be incarnational? How can we make cosmetic changes to our lifestyle without compromising our integrity or devaluing our worldview in order to have the opportunity to share the good news? Here we'll start with a famous passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, written by the Apostle Paul, who considered himself to be the apostle of the Gentiles. Though he himself is a Pharisee and a Jew, he felt called by Jesus to cross cultures and communicate that the gospel, that this good news that Jesus is Lord, is not only restricted to the Jews, but is now opened the floodgates for the Gentiles to enter into the kingdom of Jesus. Paul writes this, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." So for Paul, he is adapting, contextualizing himself so that he can have the opportunity to be able to explain, to live out, and to exemplify his new life in Jesus Christ. We see Paul consciously adapting himself in order to communicate the gospel so that God might be given glory and honor, and so that by his self-denial, he might be able to communicate what is good for the people. If you're reflecting on this passage with others, what are some key principles or attitudes that Paul demonstrates in his letter? Now, as we deal practically with what does it mean to contextualize the messenger, ourselves, into a different culture, here are some important considerations. Number one, language. Are you willing to learn a different language? Oftentimes, in a particular culture, there's what's called a trade language that allows you to enter into the more educated in society. And there's also the heart language that allows you to enter a more homogeneous community. So for example, when we were in Guinea, the trade language was French because Guinea was a French colony. But when we lived in the towns and the villages, we learned Pular, which is the language of the Fulani in that part of West Africa. And so we learned both French so that we can get around and function in that country, but we also learned the heart language of Pular so that we can communicate and build friendships with the people who more often than not only speak that heart language. Number two, clothing. Will you continue to wear Western fashion, or will you try to wear indigenous clothing that's appropriate for that culture and in that context? In some cases, some clothing might make you seem foreign or upper class. So in what ways can you adapt what you're wearing so that you can fit in more into that group, into that community? In certain circumstances, indigenous clothing can make you seem more familiar and more respectful of that culture and shows that you're willing to adapt. And what are the social norms? If you have piercings, are you willing to take off your ear piercings or nose piercings in order to be better accepted in a different culture? If the women in that particular community wear head wraps or shawls, are you as a woman willing to wear head wraps and shawls? The next consideration is housing. What are your non-negotiable convictions when it comes to housing for you and your family? Will you be living in Western style houses, or are you willing to live in more indigenous types of housing? Will you separate yourself off into kind of a Christian or Western ghetto, or are you willing to live with people from that culture within your compound or within your apartment buildings? Next is the all-important food. Will you only eat the foods that you're used to, or are you willing to explore the foods that are offered to you and that the people in that community eat? Next consideration is transportation. Will you drive your own car, ride your own moto, ride your own bike, or are you willing to travel how they travel, in tuk-tuks, or jeepneys, or trains, or buses? Another important consideration is gatherings. Will you only gather with other expats, or are you willing to go where other nationals gather, when they gather? For example, in baby naming ceremonies, or in weddings, or in funerals, or other important milestones or festivals that they might have. So these are just some examples of how one might contextualize oneself in living in a different culture. What are other examples in your mind where you'd need to contextualize yourself in a different setting, in a different cultural context? Now, whenever we experience change, we also experience stress. And this stress of adaptation and contextualization is called culture shock. And it's good to prepare for it mentally and spiritually. Now, in order to manage culture shock well, it's important to ask these questions about these aspects of what you would do before you enter into that culture and environment. Pictured here is the cultural adaptation curve, where the x-axis is the period of time that you've spent in a different culture, and the y-axis representing your mood or your happiness meter. At first, when you enter into a new culture, everything is new, everything is fascinating, everything is so wonderful that you're in this honeymoon period where you're full of endorphins, full of joy and anticipation. But over time, when things start to annoy you, or you start to question things, why do people do things this way? Why do I need to make these changes? Then your mood decreases and you end up with this feeling of perhaps of annoyance or anger or hostility. And that would be the lowest point of culture shock. And this would be the point where you'd probably likely want to go back home and not have to come back. And for some, it's usually a few months after entering into a new culture. For others, it's almost a year before they experience this culture shock. But almost everyone will experience this to some degree and at some point in their cross-cultural journey. And one important principle that we've learned is to go through this culture shock, not just by ourselves, but in community. Share your frustrations, share your anger, share your questions with others who have experienced this as well. And to persevere and not give up on that culture, because God loves them and God created them in His image, and He wants you to continue to pursue them as God has pursued us. And another important aspect is finding the humor in certain circumstances, and that helps to get us out of that culture shock, out of that valley. And over time, we find a new normal, a new equilibrium to our lives in a different culture. And it may not be the case that our happiness was as high as our honeymoon period, but it will also not be as low as our culture shock period. Furthermore, it's also important to realize that this is not just a one and done cultural adaptation curve, but there might be different cycles and different curves and different depths of these cultural shock. Now, it'd be good for cross-cultural workers to have reflected on the previous list beforehand, such as language, dress, housing, food, transportation, and gatherings, in order to manage or alleviate this culture shock, because there will be other factors leading to culture shock that will be harder to prepare for. For example, would be the culture's concept of time. Perhaps we come from a culture that is more fast-paced and efficient, and we enter into a culture that's more leisurely and, to our minds, inefficient. Or we might be coming from a culture that likes to be more direct and explain things and be upfront about issues and matters in relationships and friendships. And then we enter into a culture that is more indirect, perhaps, or doesn't express the situation in ways that we're used to, and we have to deal with that. Or other aspects of doing things. Why do they eat with their hands? Why don't they follow the rules of the road? Why is there so much garbage around? Why does everything break down all the time? Or even the concepts of change within the culture. Why can't that culture deal with the corruption and injustice? Or why can't they just change how they plant crops? Or how they construct buildings? Here are some principles to remember when we are contextualizing ourselves in another culture. 1. Proclamation is priority, and not our own comforts or rights or privileges. And secondly, we're doing this for God's glory, man's good, and remembering also self-care. Number 3 is not to cling too tightly to our home cultural identity. We need to somehow be more flexible and adapting into becoming a type of person that can straddle both cultures, our own home culture and our host culture. And number 4, master personal desires in order to reach the goal, which is representing Jesus Christ well in another culture. So I hope this was helpful as an introduction to contextualizing the messenger. Share your thoughts down below, and if you find these videos helpful, like and subscribe so that the YouTube algorithm can do its thing and others can learn more about this topic of contextualization. And until the next time, Shalom v'chesed ve'emet, my friends.